Welcome to Dark Horror Diaries, my friend. Before the show starts, do write below where are you from. Let's go. The storm had come out of nowhere. I'd heard the first crack of thunder as soon as I walked inside, feeling the heavy air press down on me like a warning. The door had slammed behind me, and I'd hurried to the living room, trying to escape the building tension in the sky. Mom and Dad were away, and I'd been looking forward to a peaceful evening alone. It was the kind of storm you'd expect in a place like this. Deep in the woods, far from any real neighbors, in a house that was older than anything I'd ever known. It's funny how you get used to things, even things that should be unsettling. The creaky floors, the old portraits on the walls, the way the house seemed to shift and breathe. But that night, something was different. I felt it, even before the first flash of lightning lit up the windows. The house was too still, even for a storm. Too quiet. I made my way into the kitchen, thinking about maybe grabbing a snack to pass the time. That's when I heard it. A soft sound, almost imperceptible, like footsteps following me, only when I turned, there was nothing there. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the wind or the house settling. But it felt like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Something I couldn't see. By the time I made it to the staircase, I had a chill crawling down my spine. I didn't believe in ghosts, not really, but I had to admit, there was something off about the place. The upstairs was where I didn't like to go, not since I was little. The attic, especially, that's where all the old things were stored. The things nobody bothered to touch. I'd always gotten a weird feeling from the place, and tonight, that feeling was stronger than ever. I moved to the foot of the stairs, my heart pounding. It was probably nothing. It had to be nothing. But the longer I stood there, the more the feeling of being watched crept over me. I tried to shake it off and headed upstairs. The house was old, built in the late 1800s, and it creaked with age. The storm raged outside, but inside it was eerily quiet, save for the sound of my footsteps on the old wood floors. The attic door was cracked open at the top of the stairs. I stood there for a moment, staring at it, knowing that was where it had all started. The air felt colder up here. I reached the attic door, and my fingers brushed against the handle. It wasn't locked. I hadn't been up here in ages, not since I was small enough to need help to climb the stairs. The attic had always been this forbidden place in my mind, full of dusty old furniture, trunks, and forgotten memories. But tonight, it felt like there was something more. Something watching me from the shadows. I pushed the door open, and the scent of old wood and musty fabric hit me like a wave. The attic was dimly lit by a single, flickering bulb hanging overhead. It wasn't much, but enough to make the darkness in the corners feel even more oppressive. The light swung slightly, casting long, erratic shadows across the room. I didn't know why, but the atmosphere made me feel like I shouldn't be here. I glanced around, my eyes lingering on the large wooden trunk in the far corner. It looked like something straight out of a time long past. Old leather straps, tarnished brass locks. I had always been curious about it. It had belonged to the house's original owners, a couple who had vanished under mysterious circumstances many years ago. The rumors about them were unsettling, but I never paid much attention to them. Ghost stories and urban legends had always been part of the charm of living in an old house like this. But tonight, the trunk seemed to call to me. I slowly approached it, my footsteps hesitant on the creaky floorboards. The closer I got, the more I felt like I was intruding on something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. My heart was racing, and I could feel the familiar tension in my chest. The kind that always arrived when something was about to go wrong. When my hand touched the trunk, a sudden chill washed over me. It wasn't the cold air of the storm outside. It was something else. Something unnatural. For a moment I hesitated, a strange sense of dread flooding my mind. But then, against my better judgment, I unclasped the old brass locks, the sound of metal against metal echoing too loudly in the stillness of the attic. The lid creaked open, revealing a jumble of old clothes, papers, and books. But something else caught my eye. A journal, bound in worn leather, its pages yellowed with age. I reached for it, my hands trembling slightly as I flipped it open. The handwriting was neat, meticulous, but the words were disturbing. The exorcism failed. The spirit is trapped. It cannot be released, but I fear it will grow stronger. It will find a way. The words sent a jolt of panic through me, and I slammed the journal shut, my breath coming faster now. What had I just found? A sense of terror gripped my chest, and I felt my stomach lurch. I needed to get out of the attic. I needed to leave this place before whatever this was could touch me. But as I turned to leave, I froze. There, in the corner of the room, a figure stood watching me. It was the same figure I had seen out of the corner of my eye earlier. Tall, dressed in what looked like old Victorian clothing, with a faint glow around him. He didn't move, but I could feel his presence growing stronger, pressing in on me from all sides. I couldn't move. The air in the attic had thickened, pressing against my chest with a weight I couldn't explain. The figure stood motionless in the corner, its features obscured by the dim light, but its presence was undeniable. I tried to swallow, but my throat felt dry like it had been coated in dust. The journal was still clutched in my hand, but it felt heavier now, like it was pulling me back toward the figure. It wasn't just a feeling of being watched. It was something deeper, something that made my skin crawl and my heartbeat echo in my ears. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. All I could do was stand there, frozen in place, staring at the figure in front of me. The storm outside roared louder, the wind howling against the old walls, but the attic was silent. Unnaturally silent. It was as if the world had stopped, leaving only me and this thing. I don't know how long we stood there, but it felt like hours. Finally, the figure moved. Not with a jerk or a lurch, but slowly, almost as if it were testing the space around it. It was a man, dressed in an old-fashioned suit, his face pale and gaunt, eyes black and hollow. There was something about him that didn't feel human, like he was a fragment of something that no longer belonged in the world of the living. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. It was as if the air itself had stolen my voice. The figure took a step forward, his feet making no sound on the wooden floor. The moment he moved, I felt an icy coldness wash over me, colder than the storm outside, colder than any winter night. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper, my voice barely a breath. But the figure didn't respond. Instead, he seemed to stare right through me, his gaze piercing, unsettling. I backed away slowly, but the figure followed, each step calculated, purposeful. Panic surged in my veins, and I stumbled, my foot catching on an old wooden beam. I fell backward, the journal slipping from my hands and hitting the floor with a soft thud. The figure's eyes flickered down to the book, and for a moment I saw something in them. Something dark, something that recognized the object. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the figure was gone. One moment, he was standing right in front of me, and the next, he had vanished into thin air, leaving only the echo of his presence in the cold, stagnant air of the attic. My breath came in shallow gasps as I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what had just happened. I didn't know who that was or why he had been there, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't finished with me yet. It had a reason for being here. It had a reason for showing itself to me. And I had just unleashed something far darker than I could ever have imagined. I didn't dare go back into the attic. The storm outside had intensified, the wind whipping against the windows like a warning. But inside, the house had grown unnaturally still. I couldn't stop shaking. My heart raced in my chest, and my hands were clammy, slick with sweat. The figure, that man in the Victorian clothing, had been real. I had felt it, seen it. And now I couldn't escape the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the walls, waiting. The journal was still on the floor where it had fallen. I didn't want to touch it. Every instinct in me screamed to leave it alone, but something in the back of my mind urged me to understand what I had uncovered. I couldn't shake the thought. What had I awakened? I picked up the journal cautiously, holding it as far from my body as I could, as though it might bite. As I opened it again, the pages seemed to almost rustle with anticipation, as if it too were waiting for me to uncover the truth. The writing was scrawled in a hurried, frantic hand, and the words blurred in my vision. The ritual, I read aloud to myself, my voice trembling, was not meant for release. The spirit has been bound. I stopped, my finger tracing the page as my stomach churned. A strange sense of déjà vu washed over me, as if I had read those words before. Maybe it was just the terror clouding my mind, but the more I read, the clearer it became that I had made a grave mistake by opening the trunk, by reading the journal, by touching anything in that attic. The man, the figure in Victorian clothes, had been a part of something dark, something old. The previous owners, the ones who had vanished without a trace, had tried to perform a ritual, one that had gone horribly wrong. A ritual designed to trap something malevolent. Inside the house, a spirit that had been bound by a group of occultists. But they hadn't succeeded. The journal was clear about that. They hadn't trapped the spirit. They had only enraged it. I had unknowingly opened the door that had been sealed for years, and now the spirit was free to move through the house once again. I snapped the journal shut, the sound sharp in the quiet room. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. I had to run. But just as I turned to head for the stairs, I heard it. A soft whisper coming from behind me. "Emma." My heart stopped. I knew that voice. It wasn't my imagination. It was the voice of the figure from the attic, the man who had been watching me. He was calling my name now, and the sound was unmistakable. His voice was close, as if he were standing right behind me. I whipped around, but there was no one there. "Emma." The voice came again, this time louder, and the temperature in the room dropped, the chill sinking deep into my bones. Something shifted in the shadows. I wasn't alone anymore. I couldn't breathe. The whisper came again, louder now, echoing in my ears, filling the room with an oppressive presence. "Emma." The name sounded like it was coming from all around me, from the walls, from the very air I was breathing. It was like the house itself was speaking, its voice twisting and warping into something unrecognizable. I turned in circles, my eyes darting around the room, looking for any sign of the man. The attic door was wide open behind me, the stairwell leading down into the blackness. But the figure wasn't there. He was here, somewhere just beyond my sight. I could feel him pressing in, getting closer with every passing second. I backed up slowly, my body trembling, but then I stopped. The journal was still in my hand, the leather bound tightly. For a moment, the weight of it seemed to anchor me, like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. I glanced at the pages I had left open, the hurried writing about the failed exorcism, the failed attempt to trap the spirit. I had to act. Whatever had been awakened in this house was coming for me. It wasn't a ghost or a haunting. It was something worse, something ancient that had been bound to this place. The ritual had failed, and I had unknowingly triggered its release. But I wasn't helpless. There had to be something I could do. In the attic, I remembered the old books, the dusty tomes stacked haphazardly on the shelves. The exorcism ritual had been written down, but there were more books. More details, more ways to stop this. I couldn't do it alone, but I had to try. I had no choice. I forced myself to move, my legs heavy and unsteady, but I couldn't waste time. The whispering grew louder, and the temperature dropped further. I bolted for the stairs, ignoring the creeping sense that something was right behind me. The shadows stretched and writhed like living things, twisting with each step I took. When I reached the attic door, I turned to face it, determined to grab what I needed. But before I could step inside, I froze. The figure was standing at the top of the stairs, blocking the entrance to the attic. His pale, gaunt face twisted into a grin, his hollow eyes gleaming in the dim light. He didn't move, but I could feel his presence pressing against me, suffocating me. "Leave," he whispered, his voice like sandpaper. "It's too late for you, Emma." I stood there, unable to move. My legs felt like lead, and my breath came in shallow gasps. This wasn't just a ghost. This wasn't just a spirit. This was something that was determined to take me, to drag me down into whatever hell it had come from. I couldn't run. I couldn't scream. But I could fight. I reached for the journal. My fingers closed around it, and I clutched it like it was the only thing standing between me and whatever fate the figure had planned for me. I could feel the weight of its ancient pages, the knowledge contained within them. I had read about the ritual. I had read the words about banishing the spirit, about closing the door that had been opened. I couldn't do this alone. I couldn't face this thing by myself. But I had no choice. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its eyes fixed on me, its smile wide and mocking, like it knew something I didn't. My heart was racing, and I could feel the cold creeping deeper into my skin, into my bones. Every inch of me screamed for escape, for safety, but the only way out now was through him. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. The storm outside roared, and the house creaked as though it too was protesting what was about to happen. But I couldn't let fear control me. Not now. I had read the journal. I had to use what I had learned. "Leave me alone," I said, my voice shaking, but I forced the words out. "I know what you are, and I know how to stop you." The figure's smile faltered for a moment, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give me courage. I stepped forward, the journal in my hands, and I began to speak the words I had read, the incantation from the journal. It wasn't as simple as just saying the words. There was a power in them, a force that felt alive, and as I spoke, the air around me began to vibrate with that power. The figure flinched, his form flickering like he was being torn apart by an invisible force. But then he stood tall again, his grin returning, this time more ferocious. "You think you can banish me," he sneered, his voice filled with venom. "I am older than this house, older than your family. You cannot control me." I didn't listen to him. I just kept chanting, the words growing louder with each breath, each syllable filled with purpose. The shadows around me twisted, shifting, as if they, too, were trying to escape. The figure howled in frustration, but I didn't stop. The room grew colder, and I felt the walls closing in on me. The figure lunged forward, its hands outstretched, but it was too late. With a final cry, the figure vanished, as if he had never been there at all. The house went silent. For a moment, I stood there, the journal still clutched tightly in my hands, trying to catch my breath. I could still feel the cold, but it was fading now. The storm outside had died down, and the heavy weight of the atmosphere lifted. The oppressive presence that had filled the house was gone, replaced by a deep stillness. I had done it. I had banished him. The spirit was trapped, sealed away. But the house would never be the same. The journals had told me as much. The house had been changed, and so had I. There was no going back. I walked out of the attic, the door clicking shut behind me. I sealed it as best as I could, not knowing if it would hold. I didn't know what would happen next, but I was certain of one thing. I would never forget the storm that night, or the phantom that had tried to claim me. When my parents came home, they found the attic door sealed tight. The house was quiet, and the figure, the man in Victorian clothes, was never seen again. But sometimes, when the storm rages outside, I still hear his voice, whispering my name. And I know that some things never truly go away. For some context, I'm a 19-year-old female, and during my senior year of high school, I was living with my aunt to finish out the last 3 weeks of school, as I was graduating early. The household consisted of me, my aunt, her husband, and my cousin, who we'll call H, an 11-year-old girl. We lived in a very rural area in a house from the era when slavery was still in practice. The house had 2 stories. There was the main staircase leading to my aunt and uncle's room, and the one I shared with my cousin. Between the 2 staircases was a balcony. A secondary staircase led up to the original servants' quarters, an area that was under construction. It was completely separated from the rest of the house, with only that staircase as its entrance and exit. There was no way to access the rest of the second floor from that area, nor the attic, which could only be reached from the servants' quarters. At the time, I was home alone because I was under quarantine, having been exposed to COVID-19 after my father contracted it. My cousin, aunt, and uncle were 2 hours away, picking up my other cousin from the airport with her husband. My cousin had pestered me with stories about the 2 sisters who once owned the house when it was a plantation, insisting the house was haunted. Being several years older, I always brushed it off as her imagination, dismissing her bizarre stories. But that day, I began to question whether there was any truth to them. It was a bright afternoon around 3 p.m., and I had my laptop in my lap, drawing and listening to music while doing homework. Since I was home alone, I cranked up the music in my headphones, letting it blare so loud that it sounded like it was coming from speakers when I took them off. I'd do this when no one was around, as I didn't want to disturb my cousin if she'd been home. This wasn't the first time I'd been alone in the house, but today felt different. Out of nowhere, I heard a loud thud from above me. It was so loud that I could hear it even over the music blasting in my headphones. I took them off and looked up at the ceiling, thinking it was just a squirrel or something, which wasn't uncommon. When I heard nothing after a while, I put the headphones back on, only to hear the same loud thud again a few minutes later. I took off my headphones and stood still, waiting for the noise to come again. It did, but this time it came from outside my room, as if it were on the balcony. I knew that couldn't be the case though, since the entrance to the balcony was sealed, and it hadn't been used in years because it was unstable and needed repairs. It couldn't have been a person. I decided to leave the room and look out the window of the door leading to the balcony, but there was nothing. No squirrel, no person, nothing. By this point, I was getting annoyed. The noise was disrupting my concentration, and I needed to finish my homework. I went back to the bedroom, sat down, and tried again to focus. But as soon as I sat down, the thud came from the other side of my cousin's closet, where the original servants' quarters were. That area was sealed off. There was no way to access it unless I went downstairs and used the stairs in the kitchen. Thinking it was just my family coming home and showing my other cousin the room, I decided to take a break and go say hi. But when I got downstairs and looked outside, there was no car. I was still the only one at home. Against my instincts, I opened the door to the stairway leading to the sealed-off area of the house. I went upstairs and entered the completely empty space. There were no windows on that side of the house, and when I tried to flip on the lights, they didn't work. I turned on my phone's flashlight and walked around the room. That's when I saw her. In the center of the room, walking in a perfect circle, was a woman. Thin, tall, with dark, stringy hair and a tattered dress. The instant the light hit her, she stopped, and I heard her neck crack as she suddenly turned to face me. I bolted down the stairs, taking 3 or 4 steps at a time, and slammed the door to the stairway, locking it from the outside. The only way to lock it. I heard banging against the door as I ran to the kitchen and into the bathroom, slamming the door behind me and locking it. I curled up in the tub, keeping the shower curtain closed as I tried to call my aunt. She never picked up. I stayed in the tub until my family got home. When I heard them calling for me, I peeked out from behind the curtain and went to greet them. I explained what happened, and my aunt's response was, "Oh, you met Maggie. Don't mind her. It's best to ignore her. She won't hurt you, she just likes to try and scare people." To this day, I've never seen Maggie again, and I refuse to stay the night in that house anymore. They've since set up the servants' quarters for my other cousin and her family and removed the wall between H's closet and the servants' quarters, so the top floor is now connected. When I first moved into the apartment, I thought it would be a fresh start. A quiet place to decompress after a long shift at the hospital, where I could focus on my new job as a night shift nurse. The building was old, but the price was right, and I had just enough space to stretch out without feeling cramped. There was one thing, though. Mr. Collins, the elderly man who lived in the unit next to mine. At first, I barely saw him. He was always in his apartment, the curtains drawn tightly, and I'd only catch glimpses of him through the glass if I happened to pass by at just the right moment. He was quiet, reserved, and always watching. I could never quite shake the feeling that his eyes were on me, even when he wasn't in the hallway. I mentioned it to a few of my neighbors, but no one seemed to mind. Just an old man, they said. Lonely. It didn't take long before I started to feel sorry for him. After all, it was a small building, and he must have been in his late 70s. Perhaps older. What did I have to fear? So I kept to myself and went about my daily routine. The first few weeks passed without incident. I'd come home from my shift at the hospital, take a shower, eat something, and then fall into bed exhausted. The hum of city life outside didn't bother me much, and the old apartment complex had a charm that made me feel oddly safe, despite the odd creaks and groans of the building settling through the night. But that all started to change once I began working the night shift. At first, it was subtle, nothing to be alarmed about. A soft sound here or there, a scraping noise against the wall. I figured it was just the building, its age showing in strange ways. But then the noises began to happen more frequently. Scratching, tapping, faint whispers that seemed to come from the wall that separated Mr. Collins' apartment from mine. I couldn't make sense of it at first, but it was hard to ignore the mounting unease that came with each passing night. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just overtired from my shifts, but the sounds wouldn't stop. They seemed to grow louder. And then one night, I heard something that made me stop in my tracks. A muffled thud, followed by a quiet, shuffling sound. I froze, heart pounding. The sound was unmistakable. Someone or something moving next door. But why would Mr. Collins be up at this hour? I had never seen him leave his apartment during the night. He seemed like the kind of man who would retire early, perhaps spending his nights in quiet solitude, just as I did. I glanced at the clock. 3:12 a.m. My shift at the hospital had been long, and I was dead tired, but this sound. It was too persistent to ignore. It was coming from the other side of the wall, from Mr. Collins' apartment. Soft footsteps, dragging like someone shuffling around, their feet scraping the floor. Was he okay? Was he sick, maybe? I wasn't sure what to think, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. After a few moments, I slipped out of bed, my legs unsteady from exhaustion, but my instincts driving me. I pulled on a hoodie and padded down the hallway toward his door. The building was eerily quiet, the only sound the creak of the wooden floorboards beneath my feet. As I approached his door, I pressed my ear against the cold wood, straining to listen. I could hear the soft murmur of voices. Mr. Collins was talking to someone. But there was no one else in the building. Or at least, there shouldn't have been. I stepped back, my pulse quickening. What was going on? My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe he was speaking to someone on the phone, or perhaps he had a caregiver who came by to help him with things. But something about it didn't sit right. I decided to knock. It was the polite thing to do, after all. Maybe he needed something. Maybe he wasn't well. But as I raised my hand to knock, I hesitated. The sound of shuffling continued, followed by a strange scraping noise. It almost sounded like something being dragged across the floor. And then it was gone. I stood there for a long time, my knuckles hovering just inches from his door. The silence was deafening now, the only sound my own breathing. After what felt like an eternity, I backed away, deciding that maybe I'd been hearing things, that maybe I was just tired. I returned to my apartment, my mind spinning with confusion. But that night, the sound came again. I had never been so sure that my mind was playing tricks on me. But this time, the noises were louder. Distinct, like someone was dragging something heavy across the floor. It echoed through the thin walls, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. It wasn't just random noises. It was deliberate. Someone was moving around in there, and it was happening every night now. The next morning, I tried to push the thoughts aside. I went about my day, pretending that everything was fine. I spoke to a few neighbors at the laundromat, all of them brushing off Mr. Collins' strange behavior. One of them mentioned how he used to be quite sociable back when his wife was alive. But since she passed away, he'd grown more and more reclusive. Poor guy, they said. He doesn't hurt anyone, though. I wanted to believe that. I really did. But something about the noises, the odd way he stared through his window, sometimes for hours without moving, made me uneasy. I could feel his gaze even when I wasn't looking directly at him, like he was always watching, always there, lurking just out of sight. It wasn't normal. It wasn't right. That night, I could hardly wait for my shift to end. My feet ached from standing for hours, and I was desperate for some rest. As I arrived at my apartment, the door to Mr. Collins' unit was slightly ajar, as though he had forgotten to close it properly. I hesitated. What if he was still awake? What if he needed help? But my curiosity won out. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I walked over and gently pushed the door open, my heart pounding in my chest. The smell inside was musty old, like dust and stale air. It was dim, the only light coming from the flickering lamp beside a worn armchair. And there, sitting in the corner, was Mr. Collins. He was hunched over, his back turned toward me. His shoulders were shaking, but I couldn't tell if he was sobbing or just trembling. I didn't know what to do, whether to speak or just leave. But before I could decide, he turned around, his face ashen and hollow, eyes wide as though he hadn't noticed me standing there. "Miss Claire," he croaked, his voice raspy. "You shouldn't be here. It's not safe." I froze. There was something in his voice, something in his eyes, that made my blood run cold. His words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. "It's not safe." I stood there, caught between wanting to bolt for the door and the strange need to understand what he meant. Was he confused, delirious? His eyes, though wide and fearful, didn't seem to be looking at me at all. It was as though they were seeing something far beyond me, something I couldn't comprehend. "Mr. Collins, what's going on? Are you all right?" I asked, my voice trembling despite myself. I took a hesitant step forward, unsure whether to comfort him or call for help. He didn't respond. Instead, his gaze flicked toward the window, and I followed his line of sight. What I saw made my stomach lurch. On the windowsill, barely noticeable in the dim light, was a small stack of photographs. I didn't know why I hadn't noticed them earlier. They looked out of place, too deliberate in their arrangement. My eyes fell to the top photo, and I nearly choked on the air in my throat. It was a picture of me, taken from across the street, looking out my own window. I was barely recognizable, the image blurry and distorted, but it was unmistakably me. And the worst part, It was taken months ago, on a night I distinctly remembered being alone, curled up on the couch after my shift, unaware of anyone watching me. I staggered back, my breath catching in my chest. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. But Mr. Collins didn't answer. He simply stared at the photographs, his eyes wide with a strange mixture of fear and anticipation. As I glanced around the room, more pictures came into view. There were dozens of them, all of me. Taken from the street, from the alley, from the edge of the courtyard. Some were close-ups, others from far away, but they all shared one chilling detail. They were taken through my windows, on nights when I thought I was completely alone. My skin prickled, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. "Why?" I managed to force out. "Why have you been watching me?" For the first time, Mr. Collins seemed to snap back into the present. His eyes locked onto mine, and there was something darker, something sinister, that flickered in them. He smiled, but it wasn't kind. "I've been waiting, Miss Claire, waiting for the right moment." Before I could react, I heard the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open behind me. My heart slammed into my chest. I spun around, my pulse racing. The door had opened slowly, almost intentionally, and now, standing in the doorway, was a man. Tall, imposing, with dark, hollow eyes that gleamed in the dim light. He wasn't someone I recognized. His clothes were old-fashioned, an outdated suit from another time, but it was the way he stood there that unnerved me most. He was silent, his presence suffocating the already tense room. I barely registered Mr. Collins' low chuckle behind me. "You should have left when you had the chance," he murmured, the rasp in his voice sending another wave of unease through me. "But now you're here, and that's what I've been waiting for." I stumbled back, my brain scrambling for some way out of the apartment. The man in the doorway stepped closer, his movements smooth, almost predatory. His eyes never left mine, and his expression was unreadable. The air seemed to thicken, the atmosphere pressing down on me as if I were trapped in a vacuum. "Who are you?" I whispered, panic starting to rise. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry, constricted. My legs felt like jelly beneath me. I glanced back at Mr. Collins, who was no longer sitting, but standing now, moving with an unnatural stillness, as though he were drawn into the shadow of the stranger. The man smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was cold, twisted, as if he knew something I didn't. Something dark and terrible. "I'm just here to finish what Mr. Collins started," he said, his voice smooth, almost melodic. "He's been watching, waiting for you. But now, we're here to take you with us." A chill ran through me. The door to my apartment seemed so far away, but my legs refused to cooperate. This couldn't be happening. This had to be a nightmare. Mr. Collins, the strange noises, the photographs. It all felt like some horrific puzzle I wasn't meant to understand. But the man's words, his presence, it was real. Too real. Before I could react, the stranger took a step forward. But then, to my surprise, Mr. Collins did something I didn't expect. He suddenly raised a shaking hand, pointing at the man in the doorway. "No," Mr. Collins whispered. "She's not ready yet." The stranger paused, a frown crossing his face, and for a moment, everything hung in the balance. I knew this was my chance. It was now or never. I bolted. I didn't think, didn't hesitate. I just ran. My feet hit the floor hard as I dashed for the door. I heard a laugh. A cold, unnerving sound, coming from Mr. Collins, but I didn't dare look back. The hallway was dark and quiet, but I could feel them behind me, their presence like a shadow creeping closer. I reached for the door handle, my fingers slipping in the panic that gripped me. I pushed, pulled, and finally yanked the door open, stumbling into the hallway. I ran down the stairs, hearing the faint creak of floorboards above me as though someone was following, but I didn't dare turn around. I didn't even know where I was going, but my legs carried me faster than I thought possible. The street outside felt distant, a world away from the nightmare I was trapped in. I darted into the alley behind the building, trying to put as much distance between myself and that cursed apartment as I could. My breath came in sharp gasps, my pulse thundering in my ears. I had to think, had to figure out what to do next. I had to get out of here. But where could I go? Who could I trust? Then I heard it. The footsteps, light but deliberate, crunching the gravel behind me. They were close. Too close. I turned a corner, my body screaming for rest, but there was nowhere to hide. I couldn't keep running forever. I had to fight back. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking so badly that I could hardly hold it steady. "Please," I whispered, panic edging into my voice. "I need help. There's a man, 2 men. They're trying to kill me. Please, you have to." Before I could finish, a figure appeared at the end of the alley. It was Mr. Collins, his face twisted into something that wasn't quite human anymore. He grinned, his teeth sharp and uneven, and behind him I saw the stranger. They were coming for me, closing in, and I knew my time was running out. In desperation, I turned and sprinted toward the basement door of the building next door. I threw it open, the dank, cold air hitting me in waves. I slammed the door behind me and fumbled for the lock, but it was no use. The door burst open with a crash, and there they were. "You can't escape," the man said, his voice as cold as ever. But then, in a moment of clarity, I remembered. The basement. It was the only place I hadn't thought to use before. I led them deep into the dark, the narrow corridors twisting around me like a maze. My heart hammered in my chest as I turned a corner and found what I needed. A heavy metal door, locked from the outside. I reached for the old latch, my fingers slick with sweat, and with all my strength, I pulled it shut, trapping them inside. I didn't wait for the sound of their pounding fists against the door. I didn't need to. I was already dialing the police again, praying they'd make it in time. When they arrived, the door was open. But Mr. Collins and the stranger were gone. No signs of struggle. No trace of them. The only thing left in the basement was me, trembling and terrified, clinging to the thought that I had survived. The apartment building was demolished the following year, but I still couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. Sometimes, in the quiet moments of the night, when I'm sure I'm alone, I wonder if he's still out there, watching, waiting. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again, but I can't stop looking over my shoulder. About 6-7 months ago, my family moved to this house in Maine that was built in 1986. After we moved in, my mother became friends with the previous owners, a mother, father, and their son. Everything was fine for a while, but a month or two after moving in, things started getting weird. For context, my father and older brother go to work at roughly 6:30 p.m. and don't arrive until 3:34 a.m. Thus, me, my mother, and younger sister are home alone until they arrive home. We have a basement in the living room that was recently renovated a few months before moving in, and there's 2 rooms down there, my older sister's, who moved out a few weeks before, and my older brother's. Usually, me and my mother go to sleep 11:31 a.m., my little sister going to bed a few hours earlier. So, me and my mom are mostly alone together in the living room. Our first little experiences were just hearing noises and small things in the basement, such as light footsteps and creaks. We thought nothing of it until it started getting worse. One day, I was in my room on my computer, headphones off, my mother in the living room calling with her friends, my little sister asleep in the room next to me. Suddenly, I hear a loud groan, sounding like a girl's voice, in the bathroom right next to my room. At first I'm like, "Girl, why are you groaning?" because I assumed it was my younger sister. A few minutes later, my mom walks into my room and asks if I heard it too. I say yes, and she tells me that it was not my little sister. Immediately, I felt a pit in my stomach. My mother heard it behind her in the living room, yet I heard it in the bathroom. There were no animals in the house, and my mother's friends on the call heard it as well. We locked our bedroom doors that night. I covered mine with my dresser, and she MSD'd me sleep with a knife just in case. A few days after that, just before bed, me and my mother started hearing what sounded like talking and light footsteps downstairs. It sounded like a man. It got so bad that she made me go in her room with her with knives, since my room door didn't have a lock. The talking got so loud and the footsteps so loud that my mother called our dad and made them come home early to check the house in fear of a squatter or something being in our basement. A moment while we were waiting in bed, I heard a voice talking near the window. I thought my mom was on TikTok. My mother then turned to me and asked if I heard that scared. When my father and brother came home, they found nothing. After that, I began hearing cluttering noises in my closet at night. I assumed it was the wind, although scared. The next day, my mother walked in my room in the morning and told me that she had spoken to the previous owners, who lived there from 2012 to 2022, and the mother had told her about her son. Her son was about 8-10 years old, and his old room was my current room. The mother said the son would talk to nothing and say he sees a boy in the closet. It turns out there was a young boy who died in the area and was following the son until they moved out. My mother said he might now be following me. Another time, I was in the kitchen at about 2 a.m., everyone's asleep, and I was about to do dishes. Before I started, I suddenly heard what sounded like a child crying. I immediately got worried because I thought it was my little sister, and I put my ear up to their bedroom door, but I heard no crying in there. I went back to the kitchen and heard it again before it stopped. Another time was about a month later. I was on call with my best friend. Keep in mind it's nighttime again, and I went to the kitchen to grab dinner. I came back with my plate, and my friend asked what I was eating, and right when I responded, she was like, Wait, stop. What was that? Was that you?" It turns out she had heard a low hum as I was speaking, and I did not hear anything. She said she heard it on the call, at the same time as I was speaking, so it couldn't have been me. This was my last experience and most recent. I was walking downstairs to grab something from my brother's room in the basement, and as I was walking up the stairs on the last few steps, I heard what sounded like a woman humming for almost 2 seconds. As I walked into the living room, I looked at my mom on the couch and was like, "What the hell, Mom? You scared me so much." And she said, "What?" She sounded confused. And I told her I heard her hum, and she confusedly denied it. We asked my little sister, but she also denied it. I immediately called my best friend to tell her what happened, and as I was explaining, my mother was leaning over the stairs before yelling, "I just heard it." My mom sounded genuinely both afraid and shocked. I could barely sleep that night. We have since moved out, a few weeks after that last experience. We haven't experienced a single thing since then in our new house. I always used to wish to experience something paranormal, but after months of living there, I am grateful that it's over. It made us feeling scared and not safe, especially with my father and brother gone every night, barely believing us when we told them about it. Sorry if this doesn't make much sense, I just wanted to document before I forget. It was supposed to be a quiet, relaxing summer in the middle of nowhere. Willow Creek was a small town nestled between thick forests, with a population so low that it was easy to feel like you were the only one around. My parents had moved us here for a fresh start, away from the noise of the city. The house we rented was old, much older than I had anticipated. They said it was part of the charm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. The house was large for just the three of us, but the space felt empty, the walls too wide, as if they had been waiting for someone to fill them. My room was at the far end of the second floor, overlooking the backyard. It had a nice view of the trees, but at night, the branches always seemed to sway a little too much, even when there was no wind. I dismissed it at first, thinking it was just me adjusting to a new place, but as the days wore on, I began to feel something wasn't right. It started with whispers. At night, I would hear faint voices, too quiet to make out, but loud enough to make me sit up in bed. I told myself it was just the old house creaking, or maybe the wind, but the whispers were consistent, always at the same time, just after midnight. I tried to ignore it, but when you're alone in a place like this, it's hard not to let your mind wander. My parents were away for the weekend, leaving me home alone. It was my chance to get some peace and quiet, but all I found was silence that seemed too heavy, too thick to breathe in. The whispers had gotten louder, more insistent, almost like they were calling to me. I didn't know what it was, but something told me I wasn't alone. I decided to investigate. The house was full of old furniture and relics from its previous owners. Books, paintings, photographs, all of it left untouched. As I walked down the creaky hallway, a chill ran up my spine. I couldn't explain why, but the atmosphere felt different. It felt like the house was watching me, waiting for me to figure it out. I stopped in front of the old bookshelf in the hallway. It wasn't much, just a small piece of furniture that looked like it had seen better days. The dust was thick on the shelves, and one of the books looked slightly out of place. My fingers brushed against the spine of the worn leather journal, hidden behind a stack of books. I hesitated for a moment, then pulled it free, its weight heavy in my hands. As I opened the journal, the first page revealed a name: Maggie. It was a name I had never heard before, but there was something about it that struck me. I read on, my eyes skimming over the words that seemed almost too personal, as if someone had written them for their eyes only. The story inside was chilling, about a girl who had died in the house many years ago, her death tied to something dark and dangerous. A failed exorcism, a spirit that refused to leave. I slammed the book shut, my heart racing. I wasn't sure what to believe, but I knew one thing for certain. The whispers, the shadows, they weren't just in my head. I didn't know what to think. Part of me wanted to brush it off as some old superstition, a story written by someone who had too much time on their hands. But the more I read, the more the words on the page began to sink in. Maggie had died here. No one knew how or why, but the journal mentioned something about a ritual gone wrong, something about a darkness that was never fully purged. It didn't take much for my mind to make the connection. The house was haunted. The whispers I had been hearing were no coincidence. They were real, and they were coming from somewhere inside the walls. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I thought about what the journal had said about Maggie's spirit. The possession, the way she had become something else entirely, a creature that was no longer human. And whatever was left of her, it was still here. I tried to talk myself out of it, to convince myself that I was overthinking things. But as I placed the journal back on the shelf, the shadows in the corner of the room seemed to grow darker, deeper. I turned around quickly, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing, just the quiet, empty room, and the low hum of the house around me. The air felt heavier now, thicker somehow. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced back at the journal, its pages now closed, as though it was waiting for me to finish reading. But I didn't want to know more. What was in those pages could drive anyone insane, and yet I couldn't stop myself from wanting to learn the truth. I went to bed that night with a feeling of dread sitting in the pit of my stomach. The whispers were louder, almost like they were inside the room with me. I covered my head with the blankets, hoping that would somehow make it go away. But the sound was still there, just beneath the surface like a low murmur that wouldn't stop. I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself it was just my imagination running wild. The night felt endless, like it stretched on forever. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because I woke up to something moving in the shadows. I sat up quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was pitch black, but I could see the shape of something shifting, just out of the corner of my eye. I blinked, and it was gone. I got up and made my way downstairs. I didn't know why I was walking. Maybe it was the need to get away from that room, or maybe I thought I could find some logical explanation for what had been happening. The house was eerily silent now, the air cooler than it had been before. But as I reached the bottom of the stairs, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A faint voice calling my name from the kitchen. I stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, my heart hammering in my chest. The voice was soft, like a whisper carried by the wind, but it was clear. My name, drawn out and eerie. Jamie. I was almost afraid to move. It wasn't just the fact that someone was calling me. It was the way the voice sounded, almost familiar, like it was taunting me. I had to go check. There was no way I was going to ignore it and risk whatever was lurking in this house. The journal, the whispers, everything. This was real. The house had a past, and that past was coming after me. I walked cautiously toward the kitchen, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. The lights flickered overhead, casting strange shadows on the walls. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find. Maybe nothing at all. But when I reached the kitchen, I was met with an empty room. The air was still, but that feeling of being watched was more intense now. I glanced around the room, my eyes darting from one corner to the next. It was just the kitchen. Just the kitchen. But then I noticed something strange. The refrigerator door was ajar. I don't remember opening it. I stepped closer, my breath caught in my throat as I reached out to close it, but something caught my eye. There on the floor was a photograph. I bent down and picked it up, my hand trembling. It was a picture of me, taken through the window of my bedroom. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at the image, the realization dawning on me. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't hearing things. I had been watched, even before tonight. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in shaky handwriting, was a single word. Soon. I felt a cold shiver crawl down my spine. The words, the whispering, the figure that I had seen in the dark. It was all connected. But who would do this to me? And why? My thoughts raced, trying to make sense of the chaos swirling in my mind. I heard the noise again. A whisper, but this time it came from above me. I jerked my head upward, only to see a shadow pass across the hallway, heading toward the stairs. I didn't wait. I grabbed the photograph and rushed back to the living room. My mind was reeling, and my legs felt weak beneath me. My eyes kept darting to every corner of the room, looking for anything out of place. And then, just as I thought I might be going crazy, I saw it. A figure standing in the doorway of the basement. My body froze in place. There was no mistaking it. A figure stood at the threshold of the basement door. Dark, motionless, and eerily silent. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its presence deep in my bones, as if it were staring into my very soul. My breath hitched, and a cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. For a moment, it felt like time itself had stopped. Then, as if snapping out of a trance, I shook myself into action. I had to get out of this house. I had to find a way to escape. But my feet wouldn't move. It was as if something invisible was holding me in place, urging me to stay, to look closer, to understand. The figure shifted, and I caught a glimpse of something. Pale skin, a twisted shape, like it had been contorted unnaturally. My heart pounded as I recognized the terrible truth. This wasn't a person at all. It was something else, something born from the dark history of this place. I wanted to scream, to run, but my voice betrayed me, caught in my throat, paralyzed by fear. But then, the figure spoke, its voice a harsh, rasping whisper that sounded as if it came from deep within the earth. Jamie. The way it said my name made my blood run cold, as if it had been waiting for me to come closer, waiting for me to understand. Get out of here, I shouted, finally finding my voice, but it didn't react. It didn't move. It simply stood there, staring at me from the shadows, its eyes glowing faintly. My pulse raced in my ears, drowning out all sound except for the terrifying rhythm of my heartbeat. I took a step back, then another. The figure didn't follow, but it didn't disappear either. I was torn between the need to escape and the need to understand. I couldn't just leave without knowing the truth. I remembered the journal, the rituals, the failed exorcism. The house had been built on cursed land, and the spirit, whatever it was connected to that dark history. I couldn't outrun it. I had to face it. I forced my legs to move, heading toward the basement door, despite the overwhelming dread that threatened to swallow me whole. My hands trembled as I reached for the doorknob. The figure remained still, watching me, waiting for my next move. With one deep breath, I opened the door. The basement was cold, colder than I expected. The stale air smelled like rot, a mixture of damp earth and something far worse, something I couldn't quite place. As the door creaked open, I felt a rush of dread flood over me. My pulse thudded in my ears, and the faint whisper of the thing in the hall seemed to follow me down the stairs. I held the journal tightly in my hands, the only weapon I had left. The ritual was my only chance, my only hope. If the spirit had been lingering in the house for years, it would be powerful. Far more than I had anticipated. I wasn't just facing a restless ghost. I was up against something ancient, something capable of bending reality to its will. The basement was even darker than the rest of the house, the only light coming from the bare bulbs hanging in the ceiling, flickering sporadically. The air felt thick, pressing in around me. Each step was heavier than the last as I descended, feeling the weight of the house on my shoulders. I stopped halfway down, the hairs on my neck standing up. It felt like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in an instant. I couldn't see anything in the dark corners, but I felt eyes on me, watching, waiting. Every nerve in my body screamed for me to turn back, but I couldn't. There was no going back. I had to finish this. The journal's pages were delicate, each word written in a hurried, frantic scrawl. As I flicked through the pages, I came across a passage that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. It described the final steps of the exorcism. How to sever the connection between the spirit and the house, how to force it out for good. I felt a small surge of hope, but the words felt heavy in my hands, like a promise that could easily be broken. I reached the bottom of the stairs and stood in the dimly lit basement, surrounded by the smell of old wood and dust. There was a stone altar in the center of the room, its surface marked with strange symbols, a part of the ritual that had been interrupted years ago. This was where it had all gone wrong. The spirit, the failed exorcism, the land. Everything had led to this point. I set the journal on the altar and began to prepare the ritual. The words from the book were a blur in my mind as I began to chant, my voice trembling with every syllable. The air around me seemed to stir, as if the house itself was alive, watching, listening. But then something else joined the whispers. A soft, mocking laugh echoed from the corners of the basement, and I froze. It wasn't my imagination. The spirit was here. It wasn't waiting anymore. It was angry. The basement door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest, and the shadows seemed to shift, stretching out toward me. I couldn't breathe, my body frozen in fear. The whispers had grown louder, now a cacophony of voices, all overlapping, all angry. It was no longer just one spirit. It was many, as if the house itself had become a vessel for something far worse. I could hear footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer. Then, a low voice rasped from the shadows. "You shouldn't have come here, Jamie." I barely had time to react. The temperature dropped sharply, and the journal on the altar began to tremble, the pages flipping on their own. The very air in the basement felt charged with malice, thick and suffocating. The presence in the room was no longer just a whisper. It was a force, something dark, ancient, and furious. The spirit was no longer hiding in the corners. It was standing in front of me, its form slowly taking shape out of the shadows. The girl, young, pale, with hollow eyes, appeared, her face twisted in agony. But it wasn't her. Not anymore. Her body was just a shell, her soul trapped, corrupted by whatever had taken place here years ago. "You can't stop me," it hissed, its voice, like 1,000 voices layered over each other. I gripped the journal tighter, stumbling back until my feet hit the stone altar. The words from the book rushed back into my mind, but they felt distant, like a dream I couldn't quite grasp. "I have to finish this," I whispered to myself, but the words sounded empty, swallowed by the oppressive presence in the room. The spirit lunged at me, its form twisting and writhing in unnatural ways, its eyes glowing with an unnatural hunger. I barely had time to react as I threw my hand toward the altar, reciting the words from the book as quickly as I could. But it wasn't enough. The air crackled, and a wave of energy slammed into me, knocking the breath from my lungs. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then, just as quickly, I felt a surge of power. Something shifted within me. My voice gained strength, the words coming faster now, flowing with a force I didn't know I had. The spirit howled in fury, but the light from the altar flared, forcing it back. I could see it now. Its true form, a twisted, formless shadow, struggling against the light. The final words left my lips, and the light exploded outward, filling the room with blinding brilliance. The spirit screamed as it was pulled back into the darkness, the very foundation of the house shaking beneath my feet. When the light faded, the room was silent. I fell to my knees, gasping for air, the weight of the ordeal crashing over me. The house, the oppressive presence, the whispers, all of it had vanished. The basement felt empty. The spirit was gone. When my family returned the next day, they found the house as it always had been. Quiet still. But I knew better. The house might have been silent, but the memories of that night lingered, a heavy presence that would never fully leave me. The apartment complex was razed the following year, and the house where it all began was torn down, leaving nothing but a vacant lot. I had a ghost in the house one night. Just one night. At the time, I lived alone. Still do. Still in the same house. I was 35 and had been living in my home for about 2 or 3 years. Nothing out of the ordinary in those years. One night, I was reading in bed. It was an average-sized bedroom, and my bed faced the door, which was open. I had no pets at the time and no reason to close the bedroom door. I read most nights before bed, so I was sitting up in bed, light on, reading. For some reason, I had the creepy feeling I was being watched. I couldn't get over it. I'd be studying the words, trying to immerse myself in the story, but I could not get over the feeling I was being watched. I kept looking up. I peered into the main area of the house. All dark, all lights out, nothing. No noise, no light. I locked the front and back doors just like I did every night. I live in Minneapolis, so this was not some remote, isolated town. I could not read my book. That feeling of being watched or stared at kept growing and growing. Ever watch TV with someone, and they're just staring at you while you stare at the TV? You don't even need to turn to them because you can feel their eyes on you. Funny thing is, I didn't feel threatened. Not exactly. I didn't like the sensation. It was completely creeping me out, but I didn't feel like I was going to be attacked. I tried shaking it off, but I couldn't read. So I turned off the light and tried to sleep, but that just made the sensation worse. The thing watching me never felt like it was in my bedroom. always just beyond the bedroom door in the darkness of the rest of the house. After a few minutes of this intense feeling, I knew I couldn't fall asleep. I realized I had to do what I had to do, make sure there was nobody in the house. What if this was some survival instinct, and there was a person hiding in my home who I was ignoring? This was pre-cell phones, or I promise you, I would have texted a friend to come over right away. I could have called someone, I guess, but I did something more stupid. Got up, turned on the lights in the dining room. Nobody there. Went back to bed laughing at myself for being ridiculous. Turned out the light. Immediately, the sensation was back and equally as strong. I was being watched. I tried to ignore it, I really did. Nope, not gonna happen. Got up. Turned on the lights. I got my softball bat and I walked the entire house. I think this is the bravest and stupidest thing I've ever done in my entire life. I went into every room and turned on every light. I knew I wouldn't sleep if I didn't check every single closet, every person-sized cubbyhole. I went into the basement. I looked behind the basement stairs. I double-checked the front and back doors. Both were locked. All windows were secured. My upstairs wasn't finished at the time under renovations, but I went up there and looked in every nook and cranny. Probably a full hour had passed since I started noticing the sensation, reading in bed. If someone were hiding in my house and meant me harm, I seriously doubt a chunky 35-year-old with an aluminum bat would have done much harm, so that was dumb of me. But I felt very confident I was alone in the house. This was my mind playing tricks on me. The house was empty. I was now 100% sure. I went back to my bedroom, all the lights in the house off except the bedside light. I was still rattled, freaked out that I thought walking the house was necessary in the first place. I mean, who does that? I laughed at myself for freaking out. I started reading for a while. Then it was back. I was being watched. It was at this point I started to pay greater attention to the being watched feeling. Did I feel in danger? No. Did I feel an evil spirit? No, not exactly. I didn't like this feeling at all, not one bit. But I didn't feel like it was whispering, kill, 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 under its hell breath either. It also felt, and the hairs going up on my neck as I typed this, intentional. It was a presence, and it wanted me to know it was a presence. It wasn't trying to scare me, but it was trying to communicate its presence. I called out to the dark living room. I don't want you here. Please go away. Nothing changed. I yelled other phrases like, I don't know what you want, and even go into the light. I got that from the Poltergeist movie, the original one. This now strikes me as a dumb thing to yell, but I didn't know what else to do. I can't say I believed in ghosts, but I also can't say I didn't. I have had weird, freaky things happen in life, but nothing like this. I was being watched. Okay, I said to myself, fine. No sleep tonight. I read my book to the best of my ability, knowing there was no one in the house with me. I woke up in the morning with the bedroom light on and the book on my chest. The last time I looked at the clock was around 4 a.m. In the morning, my eyes burned since I had barely slept, and I felt hungover, exhausted from tension. The feeling of being watched was also gone. I walked around the house, and it felt like it did every day, just normal. I called in sick to work and slept until noon. Since I had the day off, that afternoon I did house projects. I was in the middle of cleaning out a filing cabinet, throwing out old papers and making room for new stuff when my phone rang. I was sitting on the floor, papers all around me. The woman said, "Is this Eddie?" I confirmed. I didn't recognize her voice. This was way before constant telemarketers calling. If this happened today, I would have just hung up rather than answering. She said, "I'm a friend of Richard. I am very sorry to tell you that he died yesterday afternoon after a lingering illness. You were one of the friends he wanted notified." Richard and I had been friends in college. He had once expressed he had deep romantic feelings for me, but I did not return them. We stayed friends but eventually drifted apart, partially due to his clubbing lifestyle. He wanted flashy clothes and jewelry, and I wanted to garden and read books. No drama, just some friends you don't keep up with. But he was a good man, and we had several years of a really nice friendship. I hadn't been in touch since I moved to Minneapolis. I was a little surprised I was on his call list, actually. The minute she said he had died, I knew. I knew that it was Richard in my home the previous night. I knew it. It all made perfect sense. The idea of being watched, of it not being dangerous but just a presence, as if he wanted me to know he was there. It was an intensity without malice. Richard said goodbye. I've never felt anything like that in the house ever again. So my father used to own a cabin. In fact, he used to own a lot of different properties, which I suppose is just a roundabout way of saying that we grew up with money. Where things get a bit complicated is how he actually made that money. The line that he constantly fed us was that he was an accountant running his own firm in an office in the city. Long hours, lots of business trips. We never saw him much. And whenever we did, he always seemed tired, his eyes perpetually bloodshot, as if he were always trying to force them to stay open. He was sent off to prison right after I'd finished my first year of college. The sentence: 15 years for washing hundreds of millions of dollars for numerous cartels. 2 weeks after he'd been booked, my mother committed act of unaliving herself. As it turns out, she'd been helping him out through the entire thing and was facing some time herself. I guess she didn't want to deal with all that and took the drastic way out. A few months later, the government had seized pretty much all his property. All of it, except for that cabin in the woods. It took a long time for me to feel normal again, but eventually I managed it. Went back to school and graduated with a good enough GP, which allowed me to snag some shitty office job a few months later. But it was enough to pay the bills. Fast forward about another year, and I've basically scrubbed that entire sequence of events out of my brain. It took a little bit of therapy, a lot of psychedelics, but I finally did it, to the point where I was comfortable enough to go back to that cabin, the one place where I'd see my father for more than a few weeks at a time during our summer trips. I decided to take along 3 of my friends from uni: Jack, Pedro, Randy. We drove down there at the beginning of May. The road leading to the cabin hadn't been maintained at all, and as a result, it had become borderline undrivable. I decided to save my vehicle the stress and parked in a nearby lot, leaving us about a 1.5-mile trek through the woods, which really wasn't so bad. Our time in the cabin was pretty much spent getting drunk and stoned, and by the 3rd night we had completely run out of food. We decided to take the 30-minute walk over to the nearest rest stop, where I knew that there was a 24/7 diner. So we go there, eat our meals, and on the way back we notice a burning smell in the woods, as if there was a bonfire raging about nearby. Of course that was a bit strange given that it was around 2 a.m. But we didn't think too much of it at the time, and we kept walking. It was only when the smell continued to grow stronger as we got closer to the cabin that we understood something was very wrong. Soon it had become suffocating, and we could see the night sky tinged with orange in the near distance. I felt my heart drop into my stomach, and immediately I was sprinting. My worst fear realized as I reached the clearing where the cabin was located. Completely up in flames, plumes of dark smoke blending in with the night. It was a mix of different emotions that hit me all at once, the combination of them creating a sense of dread so deep I hadn't thought it possible. After reeling myself in, I called 911, with the operator telling me that the fire department would be on their way, but wouldn't be able to reach us for at least 30 minutes. The 4 of us walked away from the cabin in silence, getting far enough so that the smoke was no longer scratching at our throats. Around 10 minutes later, we noticed that the orange tinge in the sky had suddenly disappeared. And I mean suddenly, like gone in a single blink. I thought I might have been hallucinating, but it was clear from their expressions that my friends were seeing something similar. Cautiously, we started making our way back towards the cabin, noticing that the smoke was no longer heavy in the air, having cleared up considerably. Once we reached the clearing, it had disappeared altogether. I looked ahead, my brain working overtime to comprehend the sight before me. The cabin was no longer on fire. Burnt to a crisp, sure, but the raging, overwhelming flames that had been consuming it just minutes prior had somehow completely fizzled out. The 4 of us looked between each other, as if to confirm we were all still seeing the same thing. Using the flashlight on my phone to survey the damage, I found pretty much what I'd expected. Complete destruction. Absolutely zero hope of recovering anything. I started taking some deep breaths, trying to calm myself down when I heard Pedro yelling out from the other side. "Guys, Where the F did this thing come from? We all walked over to him. Nestled in the debris was the corpse of something, a monstrosity. It was about the size of a bear, with the sections of its body that weren't burnt showing pale, clammy skin with deep cuts etched throughout it, in what looked to be some kind of crude pattern. Its head had been smashed in, leaving nothing but an abnormally wide-bottomed jaw which was still bearing long black teeth. It had an uncountable number of long, thick arms that it was using to hold something that resembled a human infant, one that appeared to be completely unscathed, devoid of any burn marks. The longer I stared at it, the more that I was convinced I could see it breathing. It was a bizarre enough sight to put us into a near trance. What eventually snapped us out of it was the chanting. It was barely noticeable at first, slowly escalating in pitch until it was clear that there were several human voices shouting in unison. Their tones were animalistic, their words strung together with just the bare beginnings of a rhythm. It sounded like they were speaking English, though I could hardly make out anything they were saying. The strangest part, though, was how quickly it was getting closer to us. Definitely not a walking pace. It was more like a sprint. The four of us shared a quick glance between each other, and immediately there was an understanding. We ran like bats out of hell, tripping over branches, our own feet. But eventually we reached my car, all of us scrambling to pile into it. As I was fumbling for my keys, the chanting had become deafening, to a point that hardly made sense. It sounded as if there were speakers lined up in a circle around us, all blasting that horrible noise. And the second that I had put the keys into the ignition, things went silent. I found myself holding my breath as I looked up, my eyes slowly adjusting to the darkness until what I was seeing was unmistakable. Several figures standing completely still at the edge of the woods, all human-shaped but far too large to be people. All the air being held in my lungs flooded out with one big exhale, and I slammed the vehicle into drive and took a sharp turn before speeding the hell out of there, refusing to look in the rear view until we had made it into the highway. I drove until I had reached the rest stop, which was now hosting an absurd number of police cars. I parked, got out, and approached one of the cops, asking if they were here because of the fire. The cop shook his head. Fire? No. Has there been a fire? I explained the situation with the cabin to him, deciding to leave out the creature and the chanting for the time being. The cop nodded slowly, his expression remaining largely the same throughout. All right, he said. We'll look into it, and then give you an update in the morning. For tonight, just get a hotel or something. We exchanged numbers, and I thanked him. As I began to walk away, he called out to me. Hey, can I ask you something? I turned back around. Yeah, I said. Sure. Do you happen to be my dad's named son? For a while, I just stared at him. Eventually, I nodded. Yeah, he said. I thought I recognized you. I don't understand, I told him. I've never seen you before. The cop took a deep breath before taking a quick look around. Come here, he said. Come close. Tentatively, I did so. I can't tell you everything. I don't even know everything. But I think you should have the right to know the truth about your father. All of the stuff that's happened here tonight, all of the shit that you've seen, it has something to do with him. He took another look around before continuing. Cartels, right? Was that the story they told you? It's not so creative. But I guess it doesn't have to be creative to be believable. 'Cause the shit that he was actually mixed up in, you would not believe unless you've seen it for yourself. What the hell are you talking about? I asked. Look, I have your number. I'll be in touch tomorrow morning. This is something I'm curious about as well. Maybe you can give me some answers, point me in the right directions. But not here. So get out of here before people start noticing you. And stay safe. I didn't feel like staying in a hotel that night, so I drove back into the city, dropping everybody off before arriving back at my own apartment. Of course I couldn't sleep that night, my eyes wired open into the morning as I waited for the officer to call. He still hadn't by the time that noon rolled around, and so I tried calling him instead. No answer. Eventually I did receive a call from the police, telling me that my father's cabin had burned down and that it was due to a forest fire. I told them that wasn't possible because there had been no forest fire and that I suspected foul play and wanted it to be investigated. "It's already been investigated," are the exact words that the officer told me. "Don't worry about it. Just get in touch with insurance, go over your options." And before I could say anything else, he had hung up on me. It was a mixture of anger and curiosity that compelled me to drive back down there. I'm not sure what I was expecting, but it certainly wasn't for the road leading towards the rest stop to be blocked altogether. There were 2 cop cars guarding the barrier, with a single officer signaling any vehicles approaching to turn around. I pulled over to the side of the road, and after some careful deliberation, I decided to get out and approach him and ask what was going on, just to see what he might say. When I finished the question, he stared at me for a long time. Uncomfortably long. "Emergency construction," is what he eventually told me. After that encounter, I pretty much dropped trying to figure things out. Some weird things have started happening to me since. Every night, I swear I can hear a baby crying in the apartment across from mine. The apartment that I thought had been occupied by a pair of college kids who definitely do not have children. That cop that was supposed to call me finally did, a few nights ago. When I answered, I was met with dead silence on the other end. Nearly 30 seconds of it until the line clicked dead. There's an abandoned house sitting across the street from my apartment building, one that's supposedly been there for years because the development of the store meant to take its place keeps getting delayed. Somebody has started staring at me through its second-floor window. Whenever I catch them doing it, they're quick to close the blinds, so I can never catch any details. But I know that the moment I turn away from it, their eyes are back on me. I can't confirm that any of these things are related, whether it has anything to do with my father. I just know that I don't want to deal with it and that I want it to end. My friend Adam and I rented a cabin in early July at Letchworth State Park in western New York. We wanted to see its massive gorges and picturesque waterfalls for ourselves, after hearing so much about this so-called Grand Canyon of the East. During our visit, we drove through and hiked much of the 17-mile-long park, and it certainly lived up to its hype. However, we only ended up staying one night at our cabin. The D cabins are a small grouping of one-room lodges in the southeastern quarter of the park. They are in a remote area of Letchworth, in that most tourists and hikers congregate on the western side of the Genesee River Gorge. Adam and I were practically alone in the congregation of 8 or so cabins when we arrived. A man and a woman from a neighboring cabin were packing up to leave as we were unpacking our car, and they kindly handed us a watermelon before they left. They seemed to be in a hurry, so we didn't chat with them for very long. Once they were gone, there were only 2 other occupied cabins, but they were distant enough from us that we never really saw much of those people during our night's stay. We didn't hang around the cabin long once the car was unloaded. We were on our way to a trailhead when we spotted a Civil War parade field with a cannon and memorial. It was strange seeing an empty field and barren picnicking area in a popular state park in July, so I commented that the field must be haunted by Civil War ghosts. Adam suggested that we should revisit it some night and see for ourselves. The hike itself was fun. We found our way down to the river canyon and eventually crossed over to the western side and saw one of the waterfalls. When we returned to our cabin that evening, it was already twilight. We played a few board games, ate sandwiches, then put down our folding cots. The cabin was basically the size of a kitchen. It had a small stove and refrigerator, a tiny table with 2 chairs, and 2 rolling cots. Once they were down, it was difficult to move anywhere. Scratched into the log walls were countless names and dates of past occupants. Friends, lovers, and vandals all made their presence known, some from as far back as the 1970s. We weren't the sort of people to carve our names into a cabin. "Look at that, a pentagram," said Adam. I went over and inspected the star. There were some symbols I didn't recognize around it. It stood out because every other carving seemed to either be an expression of love or just a record of someone's presence. Great, we're staying in the devil's cabin, I said, grinning. Adam shrugged it off and we moved on. We eventually sat down for a round of cards and had a few drinks. Hey, how about we cut that watermelon open, said Adam. With what? I asked. There was not cutlery of any kind in the cabin. Good question, said Adam. I think I have my pocket knife in my bag. He retrieved his Swiss Army-style knife, and it took about 15 minutes with a small blade struggling to cut through the rind, but eventually we were able to pry the melon into halves. Nasty, said Adam as we revealed the black, gooey rot which had consumed the melon. The molded innards began to run onto the floor from my half. It seemed to have liquefied as soon as it was exposed to the air. Quick, toss it. We both heaved our portions of the stinking, sopping mess out the cabin door. It was a unique, sweet, fetid decomposition. Adam and I cleaned up the floor and laughed at the gift our neighbors had left us. We then returned to our game, but soon enough we were nodding off, and eventually agreed that it was time for bed. It was still relatively early, but it was dark, and we were beat from a full day of hiking. I fell asleep immediately and slept for hours, before I was rudely awakened by a knock at the cabin door. Honestly, it was more of a rumbling like someone was shaking the door as opposed to knocking it. Darkness had enveloped the cabin inside and out, and I couldn't hear much of anything with the small fan that was blowing in the window, only a yard or so from my head. I got up, looked to Adam, who was still sleeping, then checked my phone for the time. It was 2:30 a.m. It was an eerie feeling, the uncertainty of who was at the door at that hour. I was tense, though not yet scared, as I had been camping a time or two when a ranger or park attendant had interrupted my night's sleep for various reasons. Sometimes it was because someone was missing in the area, and sometimes it was for maddening reasons like 2 tents were too close to each other, even though we had rented 2 adjoining campsites, so we could camp together. I flipped the outside light on and unlocked the door, then slowly cracked it open to look out. I was in my boxers and a t-shirt, so I immediately felt self-conscious when I saw that it was an old woman out there. "Can I help you?" I asked. I couldn't get a good look at her face, as it was mostly obscured by the dark. She had a hunchback and her long, scraggly gray hair was tucked into a green army jacket. She then held up something and I realized she was offering it to me. "I have an extra cantaloupe. Would you like it?" I didn't immediately reply, as I was floored by how rude she had been to wake me up so early in the morning just to offer me a cantaloupe. I assumed she was crazy and wanted to get back to bed, so I simply said that I would take her melon. I cracked the door enough to reach out and receive the fruit. "Enjoy," she said. I thanked her and closed the door. I peeked out of the window to make sure she was leaving, and once she drifted off into the night, I turned off the outside light, tossed the cantaloupe onto the stove, and went back to bed. I couldn't get back to sleep, as I pictured the old crone watching the cabin from somewhere close by. I thought of the unsolved Ketty murders, a family who were gruesomely murdered one night at a cabin in California. A couple of children were left unharmed in another room and had slept through the brutal slayings, and no one who was staying in any of the neighboring cabins had heard anything either. I wondered if Adam would have woken up if the old woman had stabbed me through the door, as opposed to handing me a melon. There were a few mosquitoes and moths in the cabin now, so I was also having real and imagined encounters with them, which prolonged my sleeplessness. And I couldn't quite stretch my legs, as I would touch the walls and didn't like the idea of creepy crawlies having easy access to me. But I was still tired, so eventually I drifted back off to sleep. I'm not sure how long I slept, but it wasn't yet dawn, as everything was still incredibly dark. But I was awakened again, this time more gradually, by a man's voice in the area. I couldn't understand what he was saying at first, and I figured he was some distance away. But when I got up to peek out the window, I quickly realized that someone was standing just outside the door. I couldn't quite make him out, but I could hear that he was talking low, not quite whispering, but speaking in hushed tones. The fan made it difficult to understand what he was saying, but it felt too weird, and was too much of an unknown to just confront him, so I woke Adam up. "What?" Adam's eye went wide in the minuscule amount of light that came in from the moon and the bathroom building, which was just down the road. It sounds like some guy outside the cabin is talking to himself. Huh, what time is it? He sat up, seeming to understand that I was scared, and this was some sort of situation. After 3, maybe a little after 4. I don't know, I said. An old lady came by about an hour ago and knocked on the door. Now this guy's out there. Turn on the light. I got up and leaned over the table and flipped on both switches. One illuminated the inside of the cabin and the other the outside. Adam got up and went to the door, cracking it. What's going on? Why are you here so late? Adam blocked my view outside, so I couldn't see who he was talking to. No, we don't want that, he stated. We want to get some rest. It's the middle of the night. I heard a response, but couldn't make out what was said. Then Adam closed the door. What did he want? Adam flipped the outside light off. He turned to me, and I noticed that his face had lost much of its color. He was looking past me when he spoke. It wasn't a man, it was an old lady. I could have sworn I'd heard a man talking out there. The old woman I'd spoken to earlier hadn't sounded like a man. Was she wearing a green jacket? Yep, I assume it's the same old bag. She gave me this cantaloupe. I didn't finish my thought, as when I turned to the stove to retrieve the melon, I found it cracked and covered in a dark mold, with tiny worms and larvae swarming over it. That's nasty, dude, said Adam, nearly retching when he saw it. Why would you bring that in here? It wasn't like that when I took it. I grabbed a plastic shopping bag and picked up the disgusting cantaloupe, opened the door and tossed it outside. I locked the door and we huddled over the table. What did she say to you? I asked. I couldn't really hear over the fan. She said something about having lived in this cabin during the off-season. Then she tried to hand me a knife. What? I know. She wanted me to take the knife. She said I didn't have one big enough to cut my friend's melon. We stayed awake and vigilant until dawn, thankfully without any further visitations. As soon as there was enough light, we packed up the car and left the cabin village. We had no intention of staying another night at the Devil's Cabin. The cabin in the woods. It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway, a chance for my friends and I to escape the city and enjoy some time together in the great outdoors. We found the perfect cabin on a secluded piece of property in the middle of the woods, and we couldn't wait to spend a weekend there. The cabin was an old, dilapidated structure, but it had a certain charm to it. It was nestled deep in the woods, far away from civilization and surrounded by tall trees that seemed to tower over us. It was the perfect place to get away from it all and just enjoy the peace and quiet of nature. But as soon as we arrived, strange things started happening. We heard strange noises in the night and saw shadows moving on the walls when there was no one there. We thought it was just our imaginations playing tricks on us, but as the days went on, the occurrences became more and more frequent and intense. At first, we shrugged it off as just being in an old, unfamiliar cabin. But soon, it became clear that something was very wrong. The shadows seemed to move with a will of their own, and we started to feel like we were being watched. We began to lock ourselves in our rooms at night, too scared to even move. It was on the third night when things took a turn for the worse. I was alone in the cabin and I heard a knock on the door. I opened it to find no one there, but I saw fresh footprints in the snow leading away from the cabin. I immediately woke up my friends, but they found nothing when they looked outside. It was as if someone was playing a cruel joke on us. The next day, we found strange symbols carved into the trees surrounding the cabin. It was as if someone had been trying to send us a message, but we had no idea what it meant. We were terrified, and we knew that we had to leave. But as we were packing up our things, we discovered that our car wouldn't start. We were stranded, with no way to call for help. We searched the cabin and found a hidden room in the basement. Inside, we found a strange ritualistic altar covered in blood and human remains. We realized then that the cabin was built on an ancient burial ground, and that we had disturbed the spirits of the dead. We were trapped, with no way to escape, and the spirits were closing in. We knew that our only chance was to perform a ritual to appease the spirits and put them to rest. But as we were about to perform the ritual, we heard a knock on the door, and it was a hooded figure that appeared. He explained to us that he was the one who was living on the cabin before us and had gone missing. He had to leave the cabin because he got sick and was unable to continue the ritual that he has been performing to keep the spirits of the dead away. Since he was not able to continue the ritual, the spirits were able to break free and were now after us. He suggested that we should leave the cabin as fast as we could, but we were not able to leave the cabin yet. We have to wait until the next day, as it was already too dark to go out and the spirits were roaming around. We had no other choice but to spend the night in the cabin. We spent the night in the cabin, huddled together in the living room, too afraid to even move. We didn't sleep at all, we just waited for the dawn to come, hoping that the spirits would leave us alone long enough for us to make our escape. But as the night went on, the occurrences became even more terrifying. We heard scratching on the walls and whispering voices in our ears. We were convinced that the spirits were trying to claim us for themselves. As morning finally came, we grabbed our things and prepared to leave. The hooded figure had warned us that we would have to perform a ritual to pass through the spirits safely. So we gathered all the materials we could find and performed the ritual, hoping it would be enough to protect us. We opened the door and stepped out into the cold morning air. At first, everything seemed normal, but as we began to make our way down the path leading away from the cabin, we started to feel a sense of dread creeping over us. The spirits were all around us, watching and waiting. We were in a state of complete panic as we stumbled through the woods, trying to find our way to safety. We could hear the spirits all around us, closing in, and we knew that they were angry. They were furious that we had disturbed their resting place, and were determined to make us pay. We were running as fast as we could, but we knew it wouldn't be enough. The spirits were gaining on us, and we could feel their cold breath on our necks. We were so close to the main road, but it felt like it was miles away. Just as we were about to give up hope, we saw a car in the distance. We ran towards it, waving our arms and yelling for help. The car slowed down and stopped, and we got into the back seat, tears streaming down our faces. The driver looked back at us and asked, "Are you okay? What happened?" We told him about the cabin in the woods and the spirits that were chasing us. He listened with a look of concern on his face, and when we finished, he started the car and got us out of there. We never spoke of that cabin again, but the memory of it still haunts us to this day. We all have had nightmares of the cabin and the spirits, and we can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, waiting for us to return. I was in New Zealand, finding myself in my early 20s, failing that I'd found myself a nice girl with a van, and we were trekking around surfing and hiking. All I ate was shoplifted trail mix for that whole month. We were with this annoying Spanish girl for a bit of the trip, and aimed to go on a few-day hike in the mountains on the South Island. We joked about losing her along the way to get a moment alone. We started the hike in the afternoon, and a few hours and we were at our cabin for the night. My pal felt a urinary tract infection coming on and thought it best to turn back. I have that effect on women. I decided I was going to finish the hike myself. We were mere hours in, and I had 2 more days and 2 more cabins to stay at by myself. I was actually kind of looking forward to it for some reason. Wanted to get some early 20s ruminating done probably. Think about philosophy or some shit. First day hike, a bit wet but uneventful. First cabin had modern digs. Wood fire, heaps of bunks. Some old couple there playing board games. Next day I got up and immediately got lost. Ended up off the beaten track and had to turn back. It was raining and slippery and horrible. Lost maybe 3 hours. This meant I rocked up to my second cabin right on dark instead of in the afternoon. It was so old that it didn't have a door. There were sections of wall missing. I immediately tried to get some firewood, but everything was wet 'cause it was still raining. A storm was settling in. There was an old saw on the bench by the guest book and some remnants of dry kindling. I tried to cut some wood in the rain, but it was past dark, so I accepted I'd barely have a fire that night. The last thing I did before bed was sign into the guest book, so search and rescue know who's been where and can track you if you get lost. I look at this book, and inside it were a few people's names and the date they stayed. One from 10 years ago, one from 7 years ago. Great. Then scrawled in big letters over the rest of the available columns on the page were the words "Do not stay here." I lifted the page to see the next, and on the next page over all the columns there was a drawing of what looked like a dog, like a greyhound in silhouette, but with a silly kind of human face stretched down the muzzle. I kinda smiled at it, but it chills my blood to think back to now. Just figured the warnings were like a prank or something, and the dog was an unrelated doodle. I drag a horrible old mattress out of the tiny sleeping quarters with a few old bunks, and I make a bed down by my sputtering fire. As I'm setting wet wood to dry by it, I see a metal plaque above the fireplace. It reads Hound Cabin. Basically, it just details that some old bloke and his dog lived up here, and one time the river raged such that he couldn't get across to get their usual supplies, and they died. This kind of freaked me out, to be honest, and I thought for a second about what to do. The fire was sputtering and casting these deep shadows across the cabin, and no door. I could see trees swaying and the rain bucketing down outside. I was defenseless. I put my coat back on and walked down the path to see if I could see the way back. It was stormy, but I had a good head torch. Maybe I could finish the hike tonight and not sleep in the creepiest cabin ever. But as I walked ahead a bit, I realized there was a full river right there. It was too swollen to cross, and I could only make out the stepping stones to get over it, because water was hitting them and spraying up in the air. It just wasn't safe. So I head back to the cabin to try and get some sleep. I'm sort of laying there, uncomfortable when I'm facing the door and getting chills on my neck when I'm facing away from it. I think I must have been exhausted enough that I managed to fall into a shallow sleep despite my extreme anxiety, just imagining this dude and his dog. At some point in the night, something ran into the cabin. Full on ran in. Dog toenails on crude wooden floorboards. My eyes shot open. I was on my back. My fire was dead, and the black silhouette of a skinny dog stood between me and the dark blue hue of the sky through the door. It had noticed me and bowed its head down defensively. It walked toward me in this unnatural way, like it had human shoulder blades protruding with each step, like a man walking on his hands and feet. Lighting cracks outside and lights up its face, and the breath disappeared from my lungs. Straight up winded me. It was like a human skin had been stretched over a malnourished greyhound. The head was the shape and profile of a dog, but stretched over it was the misshapen face of a man. The hound's feet looked like a human walking on its knuckles. It seemed basically hairless and had pallid white skin. It was basically over me at that point. I was in its house, and it wasn't pleased. I closed my eyes as it proceeded to aggressively sniff me all over, its nose scraping against my sleeping bag. One paw stood on the mattress as it moved down my body. I just kept my eyes shut and found myself repeating that this was just terrible sleep paralysis. Eventually, I felt it settle at the end of my mattress, but I didn't look to see. I've had sleep paralysis before it had to be that. I was on my back, that's when I get it. There's no way this man ate his dog, and this was their fate. Nope, just sleep paralysis. In the morning, I found a dog's skull up on one of the roof supports. I crushed it underfoot before I left. The river was still swollen, but I waded through and never looked back. So when I was 16, I was dating a guy who was just a little older. We'll call him Mitch. My parents never let us hang out alone, but to my surprise, they let him come on a family camping trip with us. I think because it was kind of a special occasion, since the camping season was ending, and also the site we were going to had been kind of a tradition for us. But this season, when it closed, it would never again reopen for camping, because people ruined it by dumping trash and trespassing nearby properties. Anyway, so my dad, mom, Mitch, and I are all going camping. Mitch and I have our own tent. My parents have theirs. We have an amazing first day there. We went on a Friday morning and planned to stay through Sunday night. Mitch and I spent the day walking along paths, catching lizards, swimming, exploring, and talking about creepypastas that involved the woods. At some point we were exploring and realized there were nearby properties, maybe 2-3 cabins, about 4 miles down a dirt road from our campsite. Later that night, my parents made a big fire, and we were eating burgers. My parents were drinking, and Mitch and I were trying to make s'mores while also trying to pretend we weren't terrified after talking about creepypastas all day long. I'm in the middle of trying to explain the rake to my sloshed parents, and Mitch gasps, because there's a guy walking down the road from the direction of the cabins again. It was like 4 miles away. So we all kinda get quiet, and my dad calls out to the guy something like, "Hey, how's it going?" And the guy doesn't say anything back. My dad called again, yelling, "Are you camping? We have this spot reserved." Not in like a mean way, just trying to get the guy to respond. The guy still doesn't say anything until he is like right up on our campsite, which was weird as hell because it took like 2 minutes of silent walking to get to us after we first called out to him. He comes up closer to us and is like, "Hey there folks, I just like walking around. Sometimes I take a walk down from my cabin and see if anyone's camping." So this guy sits down and talks to my parents for a while. My parents are super drunk, and I think have been smoking pot all day. I didn't know this at the time. But when I was older, they told me they were big potheads my whole childhood, because they were surprisingly chill with this strange man appearing and were very friendly. They all talked about what a shame it was that the camping season was ending, and how terrible it was that this campsite was closing, etc. Mitch and I whispered back and forth, and were talking about how weird this guy was. How weird it was that he walked this far, didn't talk at first, and just invited himself to our campsite. Then we started noticing other things. Mitch pointed out that the guy's zipper was down, and he had on some lengthy cargo shorts and his boxers were like poking out. And then I pointed out that in this entire interaction, the guy had been here maybe 10-15 minutes. Now talking to my parents, he hadn't even acknowledged us with a single word, despite sitting across the fire from us and continuously looking at us. Then we both started to notice how the guy was mimicking my parents. He went from being sober to acting like he was drunk. He started slurring his words, getting a bit wobbly, laughing which sounded very strained, and being louder. Mitch and I were so freaked out. We had been talking about creepypastas all day, and this encounter felt like a creepypasta, and the guy kept acting stranger and stranger, and there was no way to say something to my parents without him hearing. Mitch and I stood up and walked a few feet behind us, over to the cooler, and pretended to get out some stuff to make hot dogs. As soon as we had backed off a few feet, the guy switched the convo to talk about us. He asked my parents if this was a double date, and they explained I was their kid and Mitch was my boyfriend. He asked how old we were, and they told him I was 16 and he was 18. He asked if we were good kids. They said yeah. Then he asked, "Well, where are they gonna sleep tonight?" I froze and looked at Mitch, who had reached out and squeezed the F out of my forearm in fear, and was staring at me wide-eyed. To my drunk, maybe high parents, this question didn't seem weird enough to even pause. The guy was still pretending to be drunk, and he was really playing it up at this point, nearly falling off the tote he was sitting on. My parents were like laughing. We got them their own tent. The guy said something like, "Oh, that's awful nice of you. That'll be an experience for them." I can't explain it, but the way he said it was so sexual. I think this is when my parents kind of clued into the weirdness. I looked at my mom, who looked kind of slack-jawed and uncomfortable, and was staring at me with a quizzical look. The guy kept talking, asking them, "Well, I see one tent, where's the other one?" My dad was still talking to him, could barely keep his eyes open at this point. He was so out of it. My dad motioned towards my parents' tent and said that was theirs, and then threw his arm back super exaggerated in the direction of our tent, really not very far at all, and was like, "And theirs is way over there." The guy perked right up, and actually stood up a bit, and pointed to their tent and said, "So, that's your tent," and my dad agreed. "And their tent is in that direction," and my dad agreed. At this point, I'm like shaking my head at my mom, and she looks pretty freaking sobered up. The guy keeps talking to my dad about the tents, and about how he can't see Mitch and I's tent from there. It must be pretty well hidden or very far away. That's so nice of my parents for letting us have some alone time, etc. Mitch and I say we're going on a walk, and despite the woods being pitch black and us being creeped out, we go out walking down the trail the guy happened to come from. We get away far enough to not hear them and can barely see the fire, and we pull out our phones to see if we have cell signal, and of course we don't. I'm being super dramatic and type out and send my friend a long message describing the situation, date, time, description of the guy, and that I love her, and my phone gives me the message that it'll send it when it finds service. The whole time I type, I'm reading it out loud to Mitch, and he's telling me stuff to add. We try to psych ourselves up and start walking back to the campfire. The guy is gone, but I thought maybe he was just peeing, so I whisper to my mom asking where he is. My parents are both like, "He went back to his cabin a bit ago. He didn't pass you on the road." We're just like, "What?" We start really freaking out now that we feel safer now since he's gone, and we can actually talk to my parents, and we start yelling a mile a minute at my parents about how he didn't pass us, about his fly being down, and him acting drunk to match them, about how he really pressed to know where we'd sleep that night. My mom agreed with us, and said she noticed too, and it really freaked her out. My dad was pretty trashed, but said he got a really creepy feeling from the guy. Mitch and I stayed with them and talked about the guy and how freaked we were for about another hour, and then my parents wanted to go to bed. Mitch and I went and ran to our tent, and hauled ass with the whole tent and all of our belonging in it getting thrown around, and slid it right up next to my parents' tent. We couldn't sleep all night long because every crunchy leaf made us think the guy was creeping up. No exciting camping sex was had that night, but at least we didn't get murdered. Who wants to hear about a repressed memory I recovered in therapy? You do, apparently. Edit. To clarify, I didn't just discover this today. It was years ago, and I've been piecing it together ever since. Edit 2. Since this seems to be a big question, I never expected this story to blow up the way it has. I'm just putting the answer here. My mom is dead now. Died about 8 years after the events. Talking to my dad about anything beyond the weather is a fruitless effort, and frankly, I don't want to bring something like this up to him so many years later. He's happily retired and living in a cabin in the woods on a river. He's had a long, stressful life, and I'm not going to add on to that over something I've more or less made peace with after burying it for many years. And I don't know anything about band afterwards because we went on Christmas break soon after, and I didn't sign up to do band again because I still wanted to do saxophone. I do know she was gone. When I was in 6th grade, I was in band. Clarinet. I wanted to play saxophone, but Grandpa had a clarinet, so that's what it ended up being. The band instructor was a middle-aged woman, who I'm going to refer to as Miss Frond. I'm watching Bob's Burgers while writing this so as to protect her identity. Anyways, I didn't have a lot of friends, so I had a lot of extra lessons after school. After a while, she started offering me extra lessons at her house. Even then, that made me uncomfortable and I refused. She was pretty persistent though, and would offer at least once a week. Eventually, I just stopped going back for extra lessons. Anywho, one day Miss Frond announced that we had been invited to be in the Christmas parade downtown. Awesome, that's great. The school is literally a year old. It's great for exposure and best of all, fun for the kids. We were so excited. We all had extra rehearsals, and the school made sure we had whatever we needed. Permission slips were signed, everything went perfectly. The day of the parade, we all meet at our designated area. As we get dropped off, Miss Frond tells the parents where to pick us up at the end, and her and some parade officials were the ones watching over us after they left. The parade starts, and everything goes smoothly, at least from my perspective. I was so nervous there could have been a 5-float pileup, and I wouldn't have noticed. At the end, everyone gets picked up, and I'm the last, left alone with Miss Frond. Miss Frond immediately grabs my hand after the last kid is out of sight, and tells me I can call my mom from her house, and she starts booking me in tow. I had very little experience being on my own, and didn't know how to act in this kind of situation, so despite the fact that I had recently been uncomfortable around her, I went along. Looking back, it probably didn't look that unusual to anyone because she wasn't tall, and I really shot up in 6th grade, so it's not like I was being dragged. I kept up pretty well. I couldn't tell you where in particular she took me, but it was definitely further out than where everyone else parked. Her car is the only one in sight, and she starts a beeline towards it. It was one of those dark blue-green SUVs that pretty much everyone had in the late 90s. Suddenly, I hear my name being yelled behind me. I turn and see my mom, panting and sprinting towards us. Miss Frond's grip tightens and she speeds up. Mom yanked me from Miss Frond's grip and without a word took me to her car, and we went home where she proceeded to fawn over me, which was confusing because I was pretty much ignored 99% of the time. I had no idea what just happened. I never saw Miss Frond in school or heard anything about her ever again. I don't even know her first name to look her up, and my family never spoke about it again.
Thanks for listening. If you like our work, do subscribe because your support helps us keep this channel alive.